When we are courageous enough to examine situations that are common to our mundane experience, we often discover very shocking situations underlying them, very unexpected situations that are nothing like our common thought or expectation, in some cases nothing like the language that we are familiar with. There's something very interesting happening right now. And the amazing thing, one of the amazing things about it, is that it's happening in two completely different universes. In mine, I am imagining people listening to what I am saying someday, but I do not know when or where or who, or even for sure that anyone ever will. And I am composing what I am saying right now in my mind with the expectation that in some distant place from me that I know nothing about much whatsoever, someone will receive these signals and will transform them in their minds into what we refer to as understanding. But with what faculty am I composing what I say? Or with what faculties? And with what faculties will you, my audience, transform those signals into something meaningful to you? And how can I know much about what the result of that transformation will be? For unless I could inhabit your mind, I cannot have any real understanding of what that experience is about. Now what's so fascinating about this? Well, there's a lot here that's really pretty shocking. One of the interesting features is that for me, the world as I understand and experience it happens not in my mind so much, since my mind isn't necessarily a container, but as my mind. So that if I am feeling a sense of wonder about the world, it is my mind that is in wonder, and if I am feeling a sense of fear about the world, my mind is the fear. And so too, we must imagine with your mind. And so although we could be standing together in the same room, we are in many important ways in different worlds, since the world as we understand it is in, or not in, is our minds, right? Or we might say is reflected, uniquely reflected in our minds, or uniquely understood or perceived, experienced in our minds. We use language as one of the ways to cross what we imagine as a gap between minds. That gap is very strange, since it does not merely distinguish our minds, it also connects them together and informs them. We might even say we've got it backwards. They're a lot more connected than they could possibly be distinct. So the gap between minds is interesting. It has both features at once. It both connects us, or we originate even there, and we are distinguished by it. But there's another interesting feature here, which is that I'm speaking as though I imagine you are with me now, here in the place that I am. Yet there's no way for me to know in what place of time you may receive or decode my signals. It could be tomorrow, it could be years from now. I have no idea what circumstances you will receive my signals in. I know nothing about you at all. And yet I can speak as if it were possible for you and I to share information in a way that's meaningful, for you to understand my signals. I have some kind of faith that my encoding, transmission, your reception, and decoding, so to speak, will succeed. And I guess we have this faith partly from experience, but it's actually a very peculiar kind of faith when you think about it. For although we pretend that words have meanings by themselves, they don't. The meaning of any signal is uniquely transformed by the context and orientations of the recipients. Yet, so far, I suspect that just about everything I've said is relatively sensible to you. You can understand at least the superficial implications of my language. Hopefully, we can go a little farther than that and get a glimpse of just how strange this communications thing we do really is, and what some of the underlying suppositions are, because it really is very astonishing. So I'm composing signals to an unknown recipient somewhere in time, in a language I know to be familiar to many, but a language for whom each individual will have a very unique sense, relation, vocabulary, and capacity to, or even interest in, decoding. Now, what am I composing with? And what will my recipients, you, and others perhaps somewhat like you, at least in this regard, what will they use to transform or decode my signals? How do we understand? What do we understand with? And it's funny because in our culture, we're often inclined to, how shall I put it? To demote the imagination. We have cliches like, it's just your imagination, as if that's something we should be willing to dismiss as perhaps trivial. And yet, without your imagination, of course, you could not compose language. And you'd have to have a creative imagination to some degree to compose language. And so, too, to decode and translate it into an informal sense that we call understanding. So, part of what we're playing with here is the nature of imagination and its relationship with language. But what is an imagination? When we were children, what imagination meant to our experience had little to do with descriptions and definitions. It was instead our way of being. We didn't merely have imagination, we became the expression of our incredibly vital and playful joy in learning and relation with each other and the world. We were deeply engaged in the fundamental processes from which intelligent human minds, perceptive human minds, could emerge. Imagination then must have been for us truly the birthplace of our minds. And when we were children, imagination was so, how shall we put it, so absolutely near to our experience that they could not really be distinguished. We often perhaps heard adults telling us that something was not a toy, an idea too ridiculous to imagine, for a toy was not a category of thing, but a relationship to it. The relationship of playful wonder, exploration, learning, and transforming identity, meaning, and function in the mind, actively, playfully, creatively, heuristically. In other words, in such a way that intelligences develop from these processes. And of course, we all remember how, I presume most of us anyway, remember how it was when we were small with a toy that we were fascinated with, and that toy could just be a lump of dirt or a leaf, or the sparkle of the light on the water as it traveled down the gutter of the street in the afternoon, or a stick. But even a more complex toy, we can remember how such an experience did not merely transform reality, but became a whole new way of being a world, as if our own identity was fluid and could flow and reform with all with which we curiously related. And so we had these incredible faculties that could immediately transform experience, and we could not wait to engage them. Whenever we were, we would invent opportunities as they became fewer and fewer as most of us got older. But as we grew, strange things happened. Imagination and play began to be dismissed in favor of what might be crudely termed more pragmatic matters. Responsibilities, jobs, formal education, which can be a cruel replacement for an intelligent mind's natural passion for discovery and relation. Yeah. So we donned new costumes, the costumes of an attempt at public and social maturity, whatever those seem to mean. And in that process, as we grew and as our minds developed, our imaginations were profoundly impacted, inhibited, reforged. The momentums that were their pulse and organs, their anatomy was repurposed over time. And as we grew up, we slowly, most of us, lost the deep capacities of wonder, curiosity, play. We lost the ability, the almost shamanic ability, to become a way of learning in flow, where our identity either transformed dramatically or dissolved into the activity at hand, almost so completely that we disappeared to ourselves. Yeah? Not in the sense of being unconscious, but maybe in a kind of sense of being proto-conscious, alive in the before of reflective self-consciousness. Now, of course, most of us were told that our imaginal faculties that were so astonishing in childhood, for those of us that can recollect them, those of us lucky enough to recollect them, but I hope that is most of us. These faculties, we were told really strange things about them. We were told that we grew out of them, right? As if it's a natural process for you to shed all of that and, kind of become an adult, quote unquote. Yet you will find buried, in most cases, inside each adult, all of the dreams and wonder and vivacity, the rejuvenation, the incredible, hopeful intelligence of childhood. You will find the child of each person, their whole childhood, their whole adolescence. You'll find all these timelines intact and still alive, not as memories, still living in us accessibly. Not as if we are on a position on a number line of years, but rather as if we are like a tree with our origin as the very root of our being, and every moment, every year we've ever lived, arranged in rings around us, all together with us all the time. Although that origin is embedded in many layers, it is still incredibly vital and accessible to us if we shall find a context in which, or invent a context in which it is invited and celebrated into emergence and rediscovery, rebirth. But what is this imagination? This thing we say it's just your imagination. The reason for which we dismiss what happens to us at night when we dream as relatively, how shall we put it, unimportant at least. When we say it's just your imagination, it's kind of funny because obviously without one's imagination one would be completely incapable of composing language, and certainly absolutely incapable of understanding. So would you say, oh, don't worry about that, it's just your understanding? No, and yet understanding is an aspect of imagination, right? So that's not even all of imagination, but without imagination there is no understanding. There is no recognition, even. Perhaps no possibility of relation with memory, whether memory could exist or at all, for us, right? For humans, for conscious humans. So it's funny when we ask the question, what is consciousness? We're going to have a hard time leaving imagination out. So there's this strange aspect of consciousness that's hyper-verbal, kind of disembodied and very interested in abstracts, that likes to dismiss its own origins. Right? We can see the same thing in our cultures. We can see the same thing hilariously in religions, which advertise their ability to preserve their own origins. There's all kinds of ironic examples of this, especially in modern human thought and culture, where there's this aspect of mind that is very busily dismissing its own origins. This kind of verbal, conceptual aspect that wants to say, like, oh, that imagination stuff, that's not real. Funny, without it you wouldn't be able to make that statement. Without that, statements themselves would be useless. So as well as being a faculty with which we can dream and predict or reflect upon previous experience, as well as being a faculty with which we can understand language, how astonishing it is that we could form it. That I somehow, with my mind, of course my mind becomes this, it's not merely something I do with my mind as if my mind is a tool, right? My mind becomes this process for me right now, and I'm sure if you are listening and paying attention, your mind is joined in some way with mine in transcribing and decoding. So what is this imagination? Now, I don't intend to answer, but rather to invite us to marvel at the peculiarly fascinating and primordial importance of our imagination. For all the things that we thought of as pragmatic are impossible without it. Therefore, it is anything but trivial and absolutely fundamental to the possibility of the experience of our consciousness. In two different worlds, in two different times, in two different places, we are joined by the signal. And somehow, with this signal, we share, or we might say we invent, a third domain, yes, in which there is a link between us, a bridge across this distance. And this is the astonishing thing, or a truly astonishing thing, this invention of the third domain in which my composition and intentions, hopes and desires, expression, cross this gap. You willingly receive them and make, of course, what you will of them for what purposes you will. But in your reception and attention, we have a sharing, moment of sharing, and in that moment of sharing, a third position exists where we are together in unique and astonishing ways. Ways that are absolutely ordinary to our everyday experience, yet should we examine them with even a small amount of care and interest, we'll find such astonishing and improbable situations underlying them. The bridge that divides us united us first. And somehow our imaginations are profoundly involved in these origins. Would that we could, and I believe we can, together retrieve the incredible intelligences that underlie the nature of the human imagination. And in beginning to ask interesting questions together and look at our peculiar relationships with language and communication, dreaming and intelligence, we have the opportunity to recover, discover, and invent the incredible minds that are the true birthright of our human situation here on earth, and whose accessible natures exceed the wildest imaginings of our stories, our science, and our religion. Yet we ourselves are these things, their source, their body, and their truth. Only if we shall remember, only if we shall together remember, for purposes true and beautiful.